Today we're going to talk about foundation paper piecing. I've talked to y'all about English paper piecing before, which is hand sewing and is done often with hexagons, but also with all kinds of other shapes. Foundation paper piecing is done with the sewing machine, and it uses a much flimsier paper. It's a completely different technique, and other than the two techniques having similar names, there's really not a lot similar with the two techniques. So today we're going to talk about foundation piecing, also known as foundation paper piecing, and sometimes just called paper piecing, which is why it can get confused with English paper piecing. So foundation paper piecing uses foundation papers on the back of the design to make really beautiful, crisp points in your sewing. And you can make all kinds of really complex designs that will be much more difficult to make. Getting this exact size triangle is much more difficult with traditional patchwork, but having a printed foundation design is what makes a design like this much, much easier to make. So this is the North Star pattern. This is a free pattern on my site. You can go down to the link in the description, and I have a link for you to be able to download the North Star pattern. It's either in a 6-inch block or a 12-inch block, and putting them together is exactly the same. It's just, it depends what you would like to use them for. I've made mine, this one in 2 different colors of Art Gallery Fabric Solids with an Art Gallery Fabric Solid behind, and this one I chose some fun Art Gallery Fabrics prints, and I actually did 3 different fabrics. It's got some subtle tones going on there, and then a fabric for the background. So this is the North Star pattern. You can find this on the site. And what you'll want to do is you'll want to print it out on foundation paper. Now there's different templates. You've got your 6-inch, your template for your 6-inch blocks, and then the template for the 12-inch blocks. You need 4 to make your design. The 6-inch block templates 4 fit on a page, so that's easy peasy. The 12-inch block templates, you'll have to print 4 because only 1 fits on a page. Now you'll notice that regardless of which one you print, it has a 1-inch reference square. And you'll see this on, should be every foundation paper piecing design, because your printer might print like to scale or add borders or do something funky. So you want to measure that 1 inch with a ruler to make sure that it fits exactly inside that 1-inch ruler, and that way you know that you didn't distort your block, because that can make a total mess. So that's the first thing you want to do. Print 1, check your reference square, make sure your settings are right, adjust them as needed, and then print the rest. I usually print my reference one on regular printer paper, copy paper, because I don't want to waste my foundation paper sheets. Now you'll see I've got a couple different kinds of sheets here. I don't know if you can tell from the video. This one is a little stiffer, this one's a little flimsier. This one looks a little bit more like newsprint. So there are different kinds of foundation papers, and I'm going to show you 3 different kinds, all of which I've used and all of which I think are good. This one is Stitch and Sew. It is by the same people who make Heat and Bond. And so you can see here it's ThermoWeb. It is, all of these run right through your printer, by the way, so that's super, super easy. I like these because the Stitch and Sew are a little bit stiffer than the other ones that I'm going to show you, but they're easier to see through. So they've got the easiest of see-through, and they're a little bit more firm, which I really like about them. So these are my preference, which is why you'll see the pack is just about empty, but there are other options, and those options are good options as well. And depending on how, you're looking at price, some of these, I don't know, might be cheaper. So this is the Perfect Piecing Foundation Sheets by June Taylor. They are, okay, so that is this one, the flimsier kind of one. And if you were in a class with me, we would actually be able to pass these around, and you'd be able to actually see them. And this one is the ThermoWeb. So you can kind of see transparency wise, this one is a little thicker and this one is a little flimsier. But they're both great, and both will work just fine. So, and this one comes in a nice big 50 value pack. So I've got a link for that for you down below as well. And then this is actually the first foundation paper that I ever used when foundation paper piecing. This is Carol Doak's foundation paper, and it is like a newsprint. This one is harder to see through, however, it is the easiest to tear. So if you're doing a big project where you're gonna have to do a lot of ripping out at the end, this may be a preferred product for you. But I find that it's best if you have a couple friends who are all learning paper piecing at the same time, or you have friends who already know paper piecing. Ask them what their favorite is. Ask them if you can borrow a couple sheets of whatever they use, and try out the different kinds and see what you like for yourself, what you think is best. Okay, so you've taken your designs, you've printed them onto foundation paper. I want to sew up a nice big 6 inch or 12, well, it's a quarter of a 12-inch block for you today, and it happens to be on the Carol Doak paper. You can see underneath here I have a light board. Now let's try not to blind you as I turn this on. There we go. And I'm going to turn this light down a little bit so that you can see. All right. So now you can see through there, and a light board isn't essential. You can absolutely hold your page up to a light, hold it up to a window to kind of help you line things up. A light table is super helpful. But another thing that you can do is if you have a glass table at your house, or if your sewing machine has a plexiglass extension, just grab your cell phone, turn the light on your cell phone camera on, put it underneath the plexiglass, and you've made yourself your own inexpensive light table. So there are absolutely ways around buying a more expensive light table, but if you're gonna do a lot of foundation paper piecing, having a light table is super handy and can be definitely worth the investment. So what we want to do to get started is we want to cut away our excess paper just so that it's not in the way. I want to run over 2 more tools before we head into sewing. This is the add a quarter ruler. It comes in, this is a 12-inch version. It comes in shorter as well. And there's also an add an 1/8 ruler for when you're doing much more fussy foundation paper piecing. Pieces that are really small and you don't want a full 1/4 inch seam allowance, you want an 1/8 inch seam allowance. So an add an 1/8 is good for that. What it has is it has a lip right here. And that helps catch on, and I'll show you how that works when we're going to trim our seam allowances. The other thing I have is a nice hot iron. This is my Aliso Mini because we will still be ironing. Okay, so I've trimmed away some of the excess paper. I'm going to trim off the sides as well. You'll see that there is a seam allowance, a 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way to the edge. You don't want to cut all the way up to that seam allowance line if you can help it. You just want to give yourself a little bit of breathing room. Okay, so your template will be marked. Let me turn this off for a second so you can see this a little better. There's an A1, A2, A3, A4, A5. This is an older version of this pattern. The newer version has these much bigger because this is a beginner pattern, and I really wanted to make sure that you could see everything really well. So we're going to grab some of our background fabric for A1, and we'll turn our light table on, make sure that it fits the A1 piece, and it absolutely does. I've got 2 layers here, so I'm gonna cut it down to just 1 layer. And there's A1. Now, if you are using a printed fabric rather than a solid fabric, you want your print to actually be face down. So what we're looking at with this paper is actually the back of our foundation paper piecing design, and this is going to be the front. Sounds crazy, but that is the way it works, which is why if you have a foundation paper piecing design that has like letters or words, they're going to be backwards on this. They're going to look mirror image because they're going to be facing the correct way on the front. Okay, so now we have our 1. You can, if you want, grab a little glue stick and put a dab of glue here to secure this and kind of hold it in place. That can be handy. All right, I want to pump that up a little bit. Now, A2 is going to be this fabric. Now, you're going to be tempted to want to just cover up A2 completely. That's not what you want to do. You actually are not worried about covering A2. You're going to line up your piece Here we go. Let me bump that a little brighter even so you can see. So I've lined up the edge, so it's about 1/4 inch. You can give yourself a little more space because you cut these pretty generously, away from the line where A1 and A2 meet. So we're going to be stitching along this line, and we're actually going to extend our stitching 1/4 inch before and 1/4 inch after. Now for a beginner, I find that it can help to just take a ruler and extend this line a little bit so that you know where your straight line is. You don't have to do this. I just find that it helps so that you know exactly where your straight sewing line is. So now I've got my paper. It's lined up so that my stitching line, I've got both fabrics, and these two fabrics are going to be right sides together. And then we're just going to stitch down the stitching line. Now, we made sure that our fabric pieces are generous, but the goal is that what we're going to do is when this flips open, this is going to flip so that it's also right side down, and it's going to cover this area right here. If it sounds confusing, that's totally okay. Foundation paper piecing is a little bit of a head twist the first couple times you do it, but then it gets super fun with all the just really, really cool designs that you can make using foundation paper piecing. So I've got my sewing machine here. I'm just going to take this to the machine, and I'm going to sew at least 1/4 inch before and at least 1/4 inch after down this line. Okay, one thing that I didn't tell you is that I actually shortened my stitch length. You want to go to like a 1.8 or so is a good number. You want it not so short that your paper just completely rips and falls off, but short enough that your paper is going to be easier to rip off when it's time to rip it. It's just an extra perforation in your paper. Also, if your stitch length is longer, it's not only less perforated, but it's more ripping that you have to do, and so it's more stress on those stitches that are also less secure. So there's two reasons to have a shorter stitch length. So now I'm going to, on my cutting mat, use my add 1/4 ruler. I want to make sure that everything is nice and flat, and I'm going to fold on that stitch line. And I'm cutting this down to a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And I have a lot of extra fabric here. As you get better and better at foundation paper piecing, you can get more careful about what size you cut your pieces. But the first couple times, cut them nice and generous because it's so easy to have fabric that ends up wrong, especially with all the angles. So now we can open this up and press it. And that's a hot iron with no steam because I'm using the Carol Doak paper. If I was using one of the other papers, I could use steam no problem because the steam would go through, but this paper will ripple with any steam if any moisture gets in this because it is an actual like fiber-based paper. So now you can see if I look here, you flip, now that yellow's been covered, and you'll be able to see it with the light board as well. That A1 and A2 now completely have fabric in those spots. So now it's time to add A3, which is going to be this blue piece right here. Let's see if my other half is going to work. Now you're going to be tempted to just place your fabric on there. Say, oh yeah, that fits, and then sew. But remember, we want our seam allowance on this side so that when we flip it over, the fabric's like this. So what I do is I'll fold on the line that I'm going to need to stitch on. Come here. And I'm looking at my edges. I'm not worried about this part because the yellow is going to be over there. I don't have quite enough of that seam allowance over there. There, that's all going to fit in that piece of fabric, no problem. And so it sounds weird, but this is where I'm going to stitch. See how there isn't any fabric underneath over here? That's okay, because this is going to flip over to the other side and it's going to cover it just fine. So now I'm going to stitch all the way down the line between the A2 and the A3, which is actually also between the A1 and the A3. I'm going to stitch all the way down this line, go 1/4 inch past, and then I'm going to flip. The next step is to trim our seam allowances, but I always recommend going ahead and giving it that flip, making sure it fits, and it does. We're good. So now I want to flip it back, and I'm going to trim my seam allowance. So I have this stitching that went more than 1/4 inch past. I'm going to have to kind of rip my paper there to be able to fold on this seam line, and that's totally fine. And here's where we use that add 1/4 ruler. It catches right up snug up against. And cut. So now I'll be able to press this. The first couple times you do a foundation pattern, it's likely that you'll make a mistake and your fabric won't cover the area that it's supposed to cover. That's totally fine. Just unpick it and try again. It takes a little bit of practice to get that flipping backwards forwards thing right. And practice makes perfect. It's totally fine. Okay, so we're gonna use our A4 fabric. And this is piece A4. We're gonna line this up. Let me brighten that a little more for you. And we're lining up with this line right here. You can extend your line before and after if you want. I'm gonna eyeball it and just stitch all the way. If you want, you can double check, make sure it fits. Totally does, I'm fine. Make sure you flip it back before you cut. I've absolutely had it where I forgot to flip back before I cut, and I cut through all 3 layers, and then all I was left with was seam allowance on both sides and no actual fabric. There we go. Let's give this a press. Now we have just our last one. This is our A5 fabric. Again, I'm lining up the seam allowance. It's going to flip over to this side. I'm going to stitch it. Double check to make sure that it gets everything covered, and it does. I'm just right at the edge of the corner right there. I'm not worried about it. I'm going to make sure to flip it back. And now I have 2 stitch lines here that are going into this area, and I'm just peeling the paper away so that I can fold right on this line. There we go. And now I can press this. Now that we have it all stitched together, it looks a little messy on this side, and that's because we haven't trimmed it up yet. We are going to go ahead and trim it up, and we can trim it up right to these 1/4 inch marks. So I'm going to line up the 1/4 inch edge of my ruler with the big fat line, which also means that my edge is just right. And I'm going to trim it up just like I would trim up any other block when squaring it up. And now we'll see that we have 1/4 of our block plus the seam allowances. You're gonna repeat this process on all 4. You're gonna make 4 of these, and then you'll be able to sew them together. 4 will make 1 large block. When you make your full block, you're going to stitch 1, 2, and 3, 4 together to make 2 rows, and then you're going to rip out the paper in this seam allowance before stitching the 2 rows together to make the full piece, and then you can rip out that extra seam allowance, or that extra paper in the seam allowance. And the reason you want to rip that out is because your paper will get stuck way down in these corners if you don't rip it out right after making your seam, and you don't want it to get stuck in there. You want to be able to take it out later. And just like that, you're able to make all kinds of fun paper piece designs. There are tons and tons of patterns for foundation paper piecing. A lot of them, there's a lot of great stars, animals. There's so many fabulous designs using foundation paper piecing, and it's this simple to do. I designed this North Star pattern to be a little more difficult than the average beginner foundation paper piecing pattern. There are plenty of like square and a square and a square patterns that are foundation paper piece that are super simple to do, and I've done one of those here on the YouTube channel before in the Cricut Maker block of the week, and that's a pretty simple one. I've seen people do like log cabin style blocks as foundation paper piecing, but really the thing about foundation paper piecing that makes it such, like, the reason that you go to this technique is because you can get all these really great points, and I wanted you to be able to practice that in a piece. Plus, I wanted you to be able to practice the whole flipping, and when you've got angled lines like this, the flipping becomes it becomes intuitive because it isn't naturally intuitive to most folks. So if you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up. If you have any questions or comments, leave those down below. Make sure you subscribe to this channel because I have so much more planned for you. I can't even wait to share it all with you. And make sure you go to the description. I have the link to download your free block, as well as links to all the different tools that we use in this video. Thanks so much for joining me, my friends. I'll see you right here real soon. Bye now.